Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that exceedingly generous introduction, and thank you so much for having me to Tansel, to Beth, to the Sting Collective, to the Urban Institute, to all of you for being here in the flesh and through the net. It is really a great honor to be back here to celebrate this amazing space of wild thinking that you have built at the Urban Institute and beyond. You see, my history with the Institute is, by all accounts, a rather short one, as we've just heard, having first visited you only a few years ago, I think, or maybe not even 2 years ago, for a symposium on the politics, spirits, and techniques of urban habitation, to which my friend and intellectual comrade Malik Simone had kindly invited me. I am, as you know, every time I'm here, I make this disclaimer, not an urban scholar per se. But I knew the UI would be good because any place that has the good taste of counting Malik in its ranks must, by definition, be somewhere unafraid to let the imagination rip and to put its ripples to the service of our common insubordination to the cruel conditions of planetary habitation. The first intuition that I had was totally borne out, but it was more on point than even I had anticipated. Because what I encountered during those days, as when I came back 6 months later at the Sting Collective's invitation to think about the climate pluriverse, and then again today during our second round of conversations, and what I have been encountering again and again as I read Tansel's, Vanessa's, Beth's, John's, and so many others' work with absolute fascination is the sense of a kind of rare but precious collective insurrection against the absolute declension of the UK's beleaguered world of higher education. What I'm left with every time I engage with you is a kind of pulsation of a certain sort of unbound imagination, one that co-opts and appends and smuggles things through the hollow commands of the knowledge economy to attune our sensations to the unruly syncopations and wild improvisations that make up urban life on an earth at loose ends with itself. So it's not every day that one has the pleasure of celebrating the persistence of such collective endeavors, let alone the anniversary of 10 years of enduring generativity and transformations of what Beth would call urban epistemics as a critical practice of understanding not perhaps what a city is, but what it means to make it and unmake it and become undone by it as it is lived through its interstices, extensions, and surround. Long may that continue. But of course, to say long may it continue is to raise the spectre or anniversaries raise. Not only that of the time gone by, but of the one to come, which is to say, the spectre of the future. And here's the rub. Now, that sounds ominous, but don't worry, despite the generalized institutional declension, the rub is not that the future of the Urban Institute were in question. At least I'm not aware of any such conversations and very much hope that they are nowhere near taking place. I say here's the rub, not just because of the bombs raining down on Gaza and Iran, but because the future itself, even the future that, as we're constantly told by the United Nations and other such organizations, will be both planetary and urban, is not what it used to be. And it is with this provocation that I'd like us to tarry together for the next several minutes, to celebrate the coming years of the Urban Institute by reflecting on some of the lessons your collective work has and is continuing to teach me about how to think, or rather how not to think, or rather how to think outside the rhythms of this thing we call the future and the yet to come. As the planetary mess that is the present tense appends our horizons of expectations and shakes the geohistorical foundations on which this thing we call the future has stood. This is tricky terrain. Earlier in our workshop, Tansil said, I want you all to be comfortable because we're going to be discussing some uncomfortable things. So let me relay that wise proposition. This is tricky terrain, sometimes uncomfortable terrain. Sometimes the future is the last thing we have to hold on to, and I'm going to ask us not to. Beth had kindly asked me to pitch this at a broader audience, wisely as well. And of course, if the problem of the future doesn't pitch itself to a broader audience, then I don't know what does. But I have undoubtedly failed anyway. Not because I don't want to speak to the masses, as it were, but because this turns out to be really tricky terrain. I am writing about it as we speak, and our language is so imbibed with future speak that it's quite tricky to speak to it in a way that poses the problem well. It is tricky terrain because to all those who consider themselves or aspire to be modern, and therefore to many of those of us who, in the shadows of the modern project, have learned to dream of liberation, the future in some ways was ours once. A time of possibility and aspiration, hope and redemption, affluence and justice, and the sense of a better world to come. For the past 3 centuries, we have been singing its praises, extolling its virtues, and anticipating its rhythms. Modernity has been thinking, acting, roaming, and plowing the earth in the name of an unknown, yet guaranteed, uncertain, yet hopeful, horizon of futurity which promised to redeem the horrors of the past and to deliver us from the squalor of the present. It woke up yearning for its arrival, and at night the future was its consolation, its lullaby. Indeed, I would say the future has always been modern, and it has always been urban. It is worth recalling in this sense that Louis-Sébastien Mercier's novel, The Year 2440, was originally published in 1771. Imagining an alternative, secular, pacifist, and egalitarian future for the city of Paris in the year 2440, the book didn't merely prefigure or anticipate by 18 years the advent of the French Revolution in some important respects. Mercier's was also the very first book to temporalize utopia, to displace it from an elsewhere to an elsewhen. It was the first time, in other words, that utopia was imagined in the future, a blueprint for an alternative time to come. So the publication of Mercier's book in the second half of the 18th century is worth recalling, because if Frederick Jameson was right to say that it would be appropriate to register this generic emergence as the symptom of a mutation in our historical relationship to time itself, the emergence of this genre of alternative utopian futures corresponds to the emergence of progress as modern philosophy of history, inaugurating a new experience of time that claimed to break with the eschatological temporality of previous absolutist forms of government, in which predictions of the coming end of the world and the final judgment used to set limits to human ambition and hope. Indeed, just when European empires had turned the entire surface of the earth into the space of operation, of extraction and colonization, modernity made of the future a new infatuation and frontier, giving to history precisely that upward arc, bending ultimately towards a would-be brighter tomorrow. Fueled by the dynamics of extraction and appropriation from the colonies and the earth, progress opened the future up, creating a distinctly political orientation which made possible the attribution to history of the latent power of human events and suffering, a power that connected and motivated everything in accordance with a secret or an evident plan to which one could feel responsible or in whose name one could believe to be acting. And if the notion of progress opened up the future, rendered it largely unknown and unimagined, yet filled with hope and promise, this new philosophy of history, powered by techno-capitalism and its fossils, in turn engendered a new everyday experience at the heart of modern Europe, and then both promised it and progressively inflicted it elsewhere. One which dramatically distanced collective expectations from all previous experience and introduced a break between past and present, propped up by a dynamic of accumulation and expansion fed continuously from a number of sources: technical development, the increases in population, the unfolding of an ostensible discourse of human rights, and the corresponding shifts in political systems. By the 19th century, progress and its image of the open future had become not merely one idea among others, but a settled and almost universal creed. Not a value among others, but the very perspective of valuation from which other values like economic growth, civilization, human development, moral betterment, industrialization, human rights, and technological innovation were derived. Never again, Eric Hobsbawm once wrote, was it to be so easy for blunt common sense, which knew in any case that the triumphal world of liberal capitalist progress was the best of all possible worlds, to mobilize the universe on behalf of its prejudices? But if the mobilizing of progress engendered time's acceleration, introducing an abyssal gap between the present and the past, this was achieved as much through political transformations, fossil extraction, and capital accumulation, as it was through the reticulate processes of urbanization that made possible by the development and extension of that quintessentially promissory apparatus of circulation and capture that we call modern infrastructures. Indeed, infrastructures from railways and roads and telecommunications networks to electrical grids and potable water networks and sewage systems and beyond became essential features of the modern condition, as well as one of the key measures of progress and civilization across the earth. It is both because the connections established through these network systems rendered urban life governable, constituting a space where the state's administrative gaze sought to make sociality visible, measurable, and therefore projectable into the future. And also because infrastructures of circulation, production, and reproduction of both goods and people broke the chain linking bad weather, deficient harvests, food shortages, unrest, and violence, replacing it instead with what Mike Davis once called that vast global equation of human survival, that is the commodity market. Indeed, in their history of early modern debates on climate change, Jean-Baptiste Freseau and Fabien Locha suggest that if the specter of anthropogenic climate change receded in the second half of the 19th century, this stemmed as much from the new frontiers of extraction that the so-called scramble for Africa opened up, as from a reduced sense of vulnerability in the imperial metropoles to the vagaries of the climate, with infrastructural systems taming the turbulences that used to connect bad weather and social unrest. Which is also to say, to cut to the chase, that from Mosman's Paris to Mumbai's railway networks, from its endless promise to its infinite consolation, the idea of the future sustains capitalist modernity in an existentially stifling double bind. A binding on the one hand to the material and imaginative infrastructures of improvement, whose extractive and colonial foundations inevitably block the transformations they promise, and a binding to the promises of futurity such infrastructures have come to signify. If infrastructural development, therefore, has been how modernity sought to inscribe progress and its promises in the terrain and materiality of urban life, the modern invention of the future is also infrastructure's infrastructure, subtending a grammar of the yet to come, always already in our hands, one without which we seem, even now, not quite able to read the present, let alone imagine projects of liberation or rhythms of social change on unstable planetary terrain. It is in this sense that I think we might need to risk entertaining an uncomfortable idea, namely that the relationship between progress and futurity may turn out to be more than just incidental. That if it's easier, to borrow another Jamesonian phrase, to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, it is nevertheless, it would nevertheless appear to be easier to imagine the end of capitalism than to imagine the end of the future as our political horizon and home. In other words, I think we may need to approach the image of the future as constituting what historian François Hartog has called a regime of historicity, or the very modality of self-consciousness and collective organization that a society adopts in its constructions of time and its theories of change. The notion of a regime of historicity functions as a heuristic with which to elucidate an understanding not of the nature of time itself. I am not talking about sort of time in a metaphysical sense, but of its historical makeup, which is to say of the historical constructions and collective articulations of time's passage. As such, to think of progress's open future as modernity's dominant regime of historicity is nothing more and nothing less than to note that since its inception in the 18th century, modernity's construction of time and collective organization has been predicated upon the rejection of necessity, as well as the recounting of the past and the evaluation of the present as a function of the promise and prospect of shaping a world in line with one's own chosen values. The ability to chart a course invested, as every charting of a course inevitably is, in the structural optimism of stretching out a collective hand to a new, other, better world to be made, to futures to come, whether these be in the form of radical dissensus or, as is more often the case, in the inventive reproduction of the same. And yet, if the notion of regime of historicity is a heuristic means in a sense of surveying what goes without saying, of elucidating the temporal structure of what might appear self-evident, it is also, and at the same time, an especially perspicacious tool, perhaps, for articulating what is taking shape at the threshold of collapse. When what is experienced is the fraying of the regime itself, those moments of crisis of time as they have arisen whenever the way in which past, present, and future are articulated no longer seems self-evident. Indeed, it is not just that today's futures are technologically speaking, ecologically speaking, or both, more than human instead of human and planetary instead of global, though that is certainly a part of it. It is that as the rise in global temperatures and the profusion of floods, droughts, wildfires, heat waves, hurricanes, and other extreme weather events associated with climate change amplify the effects of modernity's ongoing and uneven conditions of poverty, violence, and dispossession, and subject its struggling infrastructures and political institutions to the public collective sense of widespread failure. The Anthropocene induces a crisis of time, not because it brings about the end of the world, but because the future horizon it heralds is both of a timescale that exceeds human action and representation and palpably no longer in its hold. The Anthropocene, in other words, is peak futurity, at once extolling the modern power of progressive human change, this figure of the anthropos, which elevates its power to the heavens themselves, while making present the presence of an Earth whose atmospheric swerves and geological sways elude and evade progress's tail, binding all to human histories somewhat less firmly to fantasies of improvement and civilizational promises than to uncivilized dynamics of chance, contingency, and peripeteia, no plan can account for, and no infrastructure of improvement can gainsay. So what is to be done when the future finds itself at the threshold of collapse? The temptation, of course, is to prise the door ajar before it's completely shut. The temptation is to engage and reprise the geographies and perspectives that modernity has marginalized in order to reopen the future in the face of the widespread sense of finality and foreclosure that the Earth's irreversible instability stirs up. The temptation is to attend to a host of practices and ensembles of urban social life as so many prefigurations of alternative futures to come in spite of all. Alternative, utopian, socialist, planetary, radical, ecological, revolutionary, catastrophic, subaltern, sustainable, resilient, more than human, speculative, pluriversal, dystopian, in the ruins from below. The fact is that we are still awash in futures to come, always yet to come. Futures that are neither quite delivered upon nor quite given up on. And even as the very image of the future seems increasingly to come crashing down, it is to it that so many of us nevertheless turn to find in it the promise of another planetary trajectory or the justification for a politics of hope. Now, don't get me wrong, this work is most definitely worthwhile. Calling into question the white Eurocentric assumptions undergirding dominant future thinking in the Anthropocene, what this kind of work vitally does is to tie the politics of planetary futures to local and global struggles for social, environmental, and cognitive justice, and to the divergent projects of shared life. But what our commitment to forging alternative futures in the Anthropocene tends, almost by definition, not to be entirely able to question is the historical nature of the idea of the future itself. The fact that it is only in the 18th century, with the birth of the modern Western idea of history, that this thing we call the future began to appear different from the past, began to appear different from the present. Indeed, it is not just that we now face uncertain, dangerous, perhaps unfathomable futures. In this crisis of historical time, the idea of alternative futures loses some of its efficacy because the function of the idea of the future no longer appears self-evident. To set out to imagine alternative futures, therefore, as so many of us set out to do, is paradoxically then to brush against the limits of our own imagination. For if alternative futures entail the envisaging of other possible and previously unimagined scenarios and trajectories to ones currently shaping the continuous present, they cannot quite envisage alternatives to the future as the modern regime of historicity has taught us to dream of it. After all, we know that just like the infrastructures it subtended and through which it was to become inscribed, the future has always been unevenly distributed, with the philosophy of progress establishing a geography of anachronisms that made Euro-America the spearhead of the present and made the past the proper place of the colonized. Hence, the proposition, which in what follows I would like to briefly explore with you, however uncomfortable it may be, that at stake may be something other than railing against the future's cancellation or its imminent termination or the threat of its collapse as a terminal form of extinction. At stake may be something more dangerous than reaching for some alternative radical futurism that could deliver us from the end by persuading us of the messianic powers of the not yet. It's not that there is nothing to learn from this sort of gesture, but that if the future is modernity's temporal interior, the best way to practice futurism might be to put it off for later. Because as Sun Ra sings, the future is never, never comes tomorrow, never is not. The task, in other words, might be less a matter of fabulating or prefiguring alternative futures than of slipping out of the future's grip and straying out of the stratifications through which it continues to dig and groove the terrain. It might be less a matter of building infrastructures to establish the proper conditions of planetary habitation against the future's cancellation than a matter of tipping the future out of bounds at the threshold of collapse, of assembling what Gordon Matta-Clark would have called not infrastructure but anarchitecture, and which I would like us for now to read as an unruly syncopation to the Earth's own disorderly procession and its tendency to break all promises and ceaselessly throw the dice. I am drawn to this mysterious idea and even more mysterious collective experiment in anarchitecture, much in the way that I'm drawn to much of the collective endeavors of the Institute. I'm drawn to it precisely because in the New York of the 1970s, it was always more and less than what it seemed, because nobody quite seems to know what anarchitecture actually was, except perhaps a series of fugitive practices and ideas emerging from a collective exhibition which left no witnesses behind and might have never come to pass. And yet I'm interested in it because against the modernist conception that made the problem of architecture the problem of the house, and the house a machine for living in, to quote Le Corbusier, architecture, to quote Matta-Clark, attempts to solve no problem and turns the house into a shell as it is sliced, a house that disappears as house when the line is drawn, as the line will disappear when the wreckers tip it into collapse. I am drawn to this weird experiment which seeks completion through removal, completion through unmaking, completion through collapse, which is therefore entirely given over to the riotous incompletion of all things, of a practice of the passing moment, where the imaginal architecture that the future relies upon is messed up, exposed to its own outside, turned to untimely rhythms, where nothing works as something else becomes available in the mass improvisation that gives way to speculative modalities of urban life. Now, in his current work, queer theorist Jack Halberstam engages also the elusive archive of anarchitecture to articulate a queer and trans vocabulary for the shared experience of life lived in the collapse of foundational fictions about identity, lived alongside a slow but perceptible declassification of knowledge, a movement away from the 19th century process of ordering, typing, and cataloging, and towards a 21st century vision of multiplying, confusing, and unsorting. A queer and trans architecture, he suggests, offers an extensive vocabulary for expressing unbecoming, because an architecture seeks not to orient the subject properly to the object, nor to locate either in space and time. Rather, an architecture chases disorientation, cultivates vertigo, and tilts the opposition between building and ruin on its axis, such that the body itself is no longer available to simple binary inscriptions. Like Halberstam, I am interested in the unarchitectural signature of bringing the settled to the threshold of collapse. Yet I am drawn to read its chasing of disorientation and the turning of buildings inside out as a sort of temporal vertigo of sorts as well, as a speculative image for thinking about the future's untimely outside, a syncopation of its rhythm and a splitting of its promise and plan. If, as I suggested earlier, it is not just that modern infrastructures and architectural plans have inscribed particular futures in the undergirding of urban social life, but that the future has always been infrastructure, subtending a progressive grammar of the yet to come, always already in our hands. What kind of rhythm and syncopations might an architectural practices of urban social life throw up as it pushes the future to the threshold of collapse? As I say, I'm not an urban scholar, you are, so take the following with a generous pinch of salt. But the fact is that I have been thinking through this question in part by reading some of your work on the restless improvisations and syncopations of urban life at the southern extensions, in those informal settlements and surrounds that, whatever modern skyscraping imagery of steel and glass, make up the real urban future of planetary life. One amassed soon by about 3 billion people out of crude bricks, straw, recycled plastic, cement blocks, scrap wood, as well as informal and unruly modes of social life that prop them up and hold one another's back while they can. So what would it mean to let an unarchitectural imagination guide our reading of what is being assembled and amassed in the routine improvisation around basic infrastructures of sanitation in what Tansel wonderfully calls the landscape of desire that is, makes, and unmakes Korail? How could this gesture of pushing the future to the threshold of collapse inform our understanding of the ways in which the political and economic dynamics of everyday life become ever so slightly tilted, steered in multiple directions to ward off against residents' total dispossession, even when the threats of fires and floods and the promises of eviction never let up? We could explore similar questions as a practice of shared syncopation in relation, to name just some examples, to the messy and intermittent energy landscapes that Vanessa has studied in the way urban choreographies of energy use patch up and cobble together an energetics of social and environmental life on and off grid, as the promises of electrified futures keep being made and keep being deferred or only occasionally or marginally realized. Or we could interrogate the temporal disorientation that could ensue if we let unarchitecture infuse our understanding of what John has nicely called incremental infrastructures, where housing configurations remain in a permanent state of flux, where the urban is in the making all along, not just through improvised infrastructures, but through the ceaseless creation of new spaces, cooking or sleeping areas for now. I read these and other fascinating insights from your work in the key of what Malik would call the occupation of turbulence in the planetary mess that is the present tense, where people set off about their lives without map, plan, or anticipation, such that their social itineraries become a tangle of memories, impulses, desires, and calculations of speeds and oscillations on unstable and often hostile terrain. As he says, this occupation becomes a question of how to slow things down and how to speed things up sufficiently to have opportunities to practice new ways of doing things or recuperate lost and cherished methods, but without habituation and without the worries that are baked into the projections of planification. As we all often find, myself very much included, in these and other cases, it would appear that it is the future, the possibility of alternative futures that is at stake, that seems to be in question. When he interrogates whose desires will assemble Korail's future, Tansel elsewhere calls these informal acts of futuring, and I can certainly see why. When Vanessa examines the social energetics that across different cities make heterogeneous energy landscapes livable in spite of all, she seeks insights about the situated politics of energy transitions and the possibilities for alternative energy futures in each city. When John teaches us about the ongoing and unfinished flux of incremental infrastructures, he reads this in part as prefiguring new material conjunctures from which to generate and articulate desired futures. This makes sense, both because the future is not something we usually want to give up, and also because it is a long-standing trope of progressive futurisms that the future is not something the poor can afford. That it is precisely these trials and tribulations of constantly having to assemble the basic means of their own daily reproduction that supposedly holds such residents of the urban extensions in the trappings of a present that also extends ceaselessly. So I see each of these interpretations as important gestures of resisting and bypassing the coloniality of this heuristic trap. Yet I suppose what unarchitecture leads me to wonder is whether we could imagine desire desiring something else, whether we could imagine desire desiring something more or other or outside the future one might nevertheless wish would arrive. It leads me to ponder whether part of what's underway in these improvisations is something more syncopated than anticipatory, more untimely than prefigurative, whether these aren't also practices that connect the present not with a possible or alternative or desired future, but with the force of the futures outside. At stake, as you can see, is a question not of whether or not they or we deserve a better future, but of what we take change to be. Modernity's regime of historicity made the future the domain of change par excellence. But in so doing, it also made change disappointing, if not impossible. It made it disappointing because it made us dream of a tomorrow. It told us that change would have begun tomorrow, that we would be better, or at least better off, or at least different and improved somehow, that we would have become something else tomorrow, something else then. Change, we were told, was the name we should give to the difference between tomorrow and today. And the present, this life right now, was to be mined for its future potential, for its promise to become something else. But as again sun risings, tomorrow never comes. We wake up and it's today again, though not quite Groundhog's Day. But the promised change is yet to come. And in the meantime, they built a road through the middle of the neighborhood. They moved to their own eco-friendly enclave and flattened or carpet bombed the terrain on which social life was being made and remade. So I have become fascinated with so much of the work you do at the Institute, not because you teach me how to think about urban futures, but because you teach me how to think about urban life, the urban life of radical social change in the planetary mess that is the present tense. And by reading your work alongside so much of the crazy stuff I'm into, including architecture, I'm coming to the view that thinking radical social change might demand that we see what happens, at least, if we give the future up. That it might demand that we see what happens if we tilt it out of bounds at the threshold of collapse. I'm coming to the view that an architecture of the future would turn the future into a shell as it is sliced, a future that disappears as future when the line is drawn, as the line will disappear when the syncopations of urban improvisation tip it into collapse. What I'm saying is that I'm coming to the view that thinking these unruly rhythms of syncopated social change demand a logic that eludes the future as such. It rather draws us into a different style of thinking, into a different logic of what perhaps the Chilean collective Trabajos de Utilidad Pública or public utility works would call the for now, forever. A paratactics of planetary social life that out of complete temporal disorientation assembles together turbulent modes of occupation and dispersal, where nothing works, not even the future, but something else becomes available. And an ongoing circulation of materials and relations and dreams and aspirations that are no solution to the problem of the future because they respond to a problem of a very different kind. They respond, that is, to the problem of change, not as a problem of time or of horizons of expectation, but as a problem of passage, of what has never started and could never finish, what could never be complete, of the moment that could never pass if it were not already past and yet to come while still being now. This is another way of saying that the unarchitecture of the future implies a revaluation of the present. Its present isn't, though, the extended present, the present in which the poor are supposedly trapped because they are unable to plan. The present that doesn't pass because we're still waiting for the future to arrive, to render it past. The reevaluated presence of an architecture is that of the passing moment, of the temporality of therefore now forever, a present that doesn't begin and doesn't end and doesn't wait for the future to arrive, but passes of its own accord for the sake not of a time to come, but of change itself, of other moments to recur, for the sake of the moment that always returns like pure becoming, or the ongoing transformation of everything that no image of the future can afford, but that the poor can and do perform all the time. At stake, perhaps, is not the future, but the riotous practices of sociality given in the turbulent togetherness of figuring things out. The improvised itineraries and paratactical transformations of a temporal insubordination where nothing ends since nothing has begun, but everything is transformed while tomorrow never comes. As I said earlier, long may that continue. Thanks.